Now, man moving from a measurement being to a rational being, to an empirical being, to a skeptical being, all the way down to existentialism, to a volitional being. Now, what happened? We moved from all of this ultimately into postmodernism, and the postmodern mind was basically man became the author of all being. It is not the author who tells you what he has written. It is the reader who tells you what he wants the author to say to you. Postmodernism has shifted the weight from objective statements and facts to the reader who sits in authority over it and determines whether this is meaningful or not. Now, here's where I want to take you through a bridge, which is very critical, because this, I think, is important for us to understand. The bifurcation of how this world in its thinking has separated the East from the West. In the West, Christianity has been marginalized and even ridiculed. In the East, Western religion is criticized while Eastern religion is still protected. If you go to Singapore or you go to the Oriental countries now, you'll see a resurgence of Confucius and the old writers and the sages, and they are treating their own writers of old with a great deal of respect and reverence. So in the West, Christianity is marginalized, even ridiculed, but in the East, Western religion is criticized while Eastern is well protected. In the West, Christianity has been evicted from the academy. In the East, there's a resurgence of pride in ancient wisdom. In the West, theology has been replaced by religion. In the East, religion was always seen as a process and a pursuit. So in the West, theology has been replaced by religion. In the East, religion has always been seen as a process and a pursuit. In the West, number 4, truth displaced and nothing to replace it. In the East, displacement of truth was not felt because culture was the driving force. Displacement of truth was not felt because culture was the driving force. Have you ever tried to debate the Quran with a Muslim? You're wasting your time. He will look at you and say, the Quran says it, I believe it, that's it. That's it. I talked to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and he said to me, why are you wasting your time with me? The Quran has said it. I believe it. That settles it. We have him on video saying that. Quran says it. I believe it. So the truth to them is inscripted in that one volume. The truth to India is enshrined across centuries of culture. And so you come to the West, and it is fascinating to pick up book after book after book. I raised a question in my book, for example. Isn't it interesting that in the West, when a person wants to fill in the blanks with profanity or nothing left to say, the name of Jesus Christ is so casually used? You never hear that of Buddha or Muhammad or Krishna or anybody in the East. The very centerpiece of what made this culture possible is a profane and a swear word. And the more I was reading Robert Price chapter after chapter after chapter, I didn't know whether to cry or whether to pray, or whether to say, God, where does one even go with this full-blooded hit? And one of the questions I raised of Price in an interview, isn't it interesting? He would dare not go in Saudi Arabia and decry Islam. He would dare not go in India and decry Hinduism. He would dare not go in Thailand and decry Buddhism. He would dare not go into an academy and assault naturalism. The only worldview that is open to this kind of an assault and can take it in the chin is the Judeo-Christian worldview, which alone ought to speak for the nobility of this faith that allows you the privilege of taking it on head on and still loving the person who's attacking it. In Islam, he wouldn't be standing on his feet for more than 5 minutes. He'd be finished. In India, he'd be banned and never given a visa again to come back. Thailand will usher him out, and it'll be goodbye. In the academy, if you say something like that against naturalism, you won't get a position. But the Judeo-Christian worldview has been evicted. Now, Deepak Chopra can go there and say whatever he wants. His book on Jesus is the biggest farce I have read in many, many years. I'm sure John has read it. My next book is called From Oprah to Chopra. Dealing with this. So I'm getting ready and doing my research on it. I'm hoping to bait him into a dialogue of some sort. This is where you and I stand as parents and potential grandparents. Now, is this all bad news? I don't believe so, because I think, as the gentleman said yesterday, until we are put into the fire of testing, we'll never really be able to prove whether this faith is nothing more than a cultural belief on our own, or whether it is something that drives the deepest conviction of our heart. I think when you look at China today, it's incredible to realize that they're talking about nearly 100 million believers in China. I have a copy of the newspaper article from the Shanghai Post in 66, I think it was, or 65, when Mao Zedong said, Christianity is permanently buried and will never rise again. It has been expunged from our culture. It will never show its face again in China. Today, 100 million people, minimum, they say, claim to follow Christ. When I was speaking to the Canadian Parliament about 4 weeks ago, straight from there I went to Delhi. By the way, unbelievable what happened in Ottawa. I know we've got some Canadians here. There were nearly 1,000 that attended that prayer breakfast in the morning, and Stockwell Day, who's the Minister of Peace, Trade, and in the Pacific, hosted the breakfast. And then my wife and I went and had about 15 minutes with the Prime Minister Stephen Harper, one-on-one in his office, had the privilege of praying with him. And the next day spoke at a luncheon for ambassadors. 76 different countries were represented at that luncheon, from mainly Muslim countries. And the numbers of them that actually came up to talk come from such various parts of the world where the name of Christ is quite foreign to them, inviting and opening and asking us. I've got business cards from the ambassador from Iraq, from Iran, from all over the world saying, would you come and speak? You see, I think the reality is that we need to take a step back and ask ourselves the question, is this love that I have for Jesus Christ something that I have actually experienced as well? Or is it so cerebrally driven that every time another person departs from the faith, there's a little bit of a twinge in your heart saying, I wonder if that person is right? I have met so many young people who quote these people and say, is there something to this? I urge you to Google the name of A.N. Wilson and see his interview with the British press and with the Wall Street Journal. A.N. Wilson, a few years ago, was the biggest name basically trashing Christianity. Brilliant writer, big name in the United Kingdom. Trashing Christianity, wrote about C.S. Lewis, mocked him and described him as having been beaten in a debate here and there, and that nothing more than childhood stuff. This Easter, A.N. Wilson comes back to the Lord. And when you see his interview, it is brilliant. He said he succumbed to the pressure of the media and his colleagues between the academy and the entertainers who would mock things spiritual, and he bought into their line. And the more he rubbed shoulders with them, the more he saw what would go on behind closed doors, that it was nothing more than just a lot of ideologically driven people with a bent to destroy all of this. And the more he came into contact with true blue Christians, the more he saw who the real saints were and who were the people who really had the answers to life. The British journalist Matthew Paris, log on and see his article. He says he is confounded as an atheist, having gone to Africa and come back and absolutely convinced. And he says, I do not know how to explain this as an atheist. What Africa needs more than anything else is the gospel and the missionary. And then he makes this comment. He said, now some of you may turn around and make this comment and say, why can't other NGOs and all also go and reach out? He said, no, it doesn't seem to work the same way. It's a package deal with redemption. These are people who've stood on both sides of it, straddled the lines, and they know where the real answers are. This morning when I was writing, let me see, I've never quoted from my BlackBerry, but okay, here we are. This statement by Calvin Miller, which I had written many years ago, I wrote in my book today. Listen carefully to what Calvin Miller says. The sermon and the Spirit will always work in combination to produce liberation. Sometimes the Spirit and the sermon do supply direct answers to human need, but most often they answer indirectly. Most problems are not solved by listening to sermons. The sermon, no matter how sincere, cannot solve these unsolvable problems. So if the sermon is not a problem solver, where shall we go for solutions? Together with the Spirit, the sermon exists to point out that having answers is not essential always to living. What is essential is the sense of God's presence during dark seasons of questioning. Our need for specific answers is dissolved in the greater issue of the Lordship of Jesus Christ over all of our questions, those that have answers and those that don't. Now, for you as an apologist, here's what I want you to understand. Follow me very carefully. There is a difference between a worldview that is not able to answer all questions to fullest satisfaction and a worldview that is systemically contradictory. Do you understand what I'm saying? Hinduism, Islam, naturalism are systemically contradictory. I finally leaned forward and said to this young woman, and I hated to do this, but I tried desperately to find an avenue, and I said, my ancestors were all Hindu priests, and it led ultimately to a conversion. I said, I have a Hindu friend who came to know Christ in my living room, and we talked for 1 year, Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, till I was getting fed up of this. My wife said, why are you wasting your time? I said, he's an Indian. We're used to going around in circles. Give him a little more time. And he's heard me tell this. He hears me on the air and he says, I heard you quoting me again. You said something about me. I said, yeah, I did. And one of the things I said to him was once I said to him, why do you take up so much of my time? And his answer was, you create this monster, you now feed it. That was his answer. So I quoted this man to this girl, and I said he came from a Hindu background. I said, if every birth is a rebirth, and every life is paying for a previous life, what were you paying for in your first life? I said, have you thought of that? Pata nahi, I don't know. I said, the other thing this fellow said to me was, he said, if I borrow money from a bank, they're at least kind enough to tell me how much I owe and how long I have to pay it back in. He said, karma is the most cruel thing where you never know how much you owe and how long it is going to take to pay it back. I said to her, tell me, if he raped you as a little girl in the previous life, and through you now, this was payback sometime, is the fact that you brought him into the relationship and then let him down going to be a karmic result in your next life? 2 days before I left, the Dalai Lama was being interviewed by the Hindustan Times. Here's the questioner from the Hindustan Times. 10 years ago, they would never have dared ask this question. Your Holiness, science as we know it involves investigation of something that can be measured or calculated. The concept of mind or the concept of self itself cannot be measured. Up to now, the scientific field for the Buddhist viewpoint has been limited. Mind and consciousness are outside the present scientific field because there have been many sophisticated experiments about the experience of dying and all on. And then it goes this. If Buddhism is open to a scientific question, why does the belief in reincarnation still survive when there is no supporting science or reason for this? This is the Hindustan Times asking the Dalai Lama. His answer is absolutely fascinating. At the end of it, you probably say, what? The whole system of the Christian faith starts off with the fact that Christ offers you himself as salvation. And if you do not have that experience, I simply do not know how you will withstand the assault upon your faith. I say that to you very clearly. If you do not know the presence of the Holy Spirit in your life, and the presence of Christ in salvation, I don't know how you will withstand the assault on your faith. If there's anything I urge you to do, it is to take your Christian commitment very, very seriously in the presence of God. I try to work on this every day in my life, and that's why every time I go to Delhi, I always go back and visit the hospital where I met the Lord for the first time, because that memory of Him coming and meeting me on that suicide bed and transforming my life is ever fresh in my mind. Had I had people like Dawkins and Hitchens and all of these boys helping me at that time, I would have succeeded in my suicide, because their news is very bad news.